Welcome to Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone. This is the case for capitalism. What is capitalism? Capitalism is defined as an economic system characterized by private or corporate ownership of capital goods, by investments that are determined by private decision, and by prices, production, and the distribution of goods that are determined mainly by competition in a free market, according to Merriam-Webster Dictionary. A better, more consistent fundamental definition, I believe, is a social system based on the explicit recognition of private property and non-aggressive contractual exchanges between private property owners. In other words, the only way to properly acquire property under capitalism is through voluntary exchange or original appropriation. It's important to define what capitalism is, because when you see the state confiscate billions and give it to banks, it does not fit either of these definitions. Before getting into the economic merits of capitalism, it's important to ask if it's fundamentally moral. You could talk about the benefits of theft, of prearranged marriages, of slavery, of nuking cities. However, these things are inherently immoral, so they should not be discussed further. Coercion is evil precisely because it thus eliminates an individual as a thinking and valuing person and makes him a bare tool in the achievement of the ends of another. Friedrich Hayek, Nobel Prize-winning economist. In other words, good ideas don't require the initiation of force. This does not mean you cannot defend yourself against aggressors from your body or your property. Free trade is an aspect of capitalism that treats people in other countries just like you would treat your neighbors. You have the ability to trade with them voluntarily. This quote has not been directly attributed to Bastiat, but the quote is, "If goods don't cross borders, troops surely will." In other words, when it's not in your economic interest, countries tend to go to war, and this is inherently immoral because it destroys the lives of millions of innocent people. Prior to capitalism, the way people amassed great wealth was by looting, plundering, and enslaving their fellow man. Capitalism made it possible to become wealthy by serving your fellow man. Economist Walter E. Williams. Today I want to go over some common objections, including robber barons, child labor, inequality, monopoly and the need for regulation, the environment, the exploitation of workers, the causing of recession, and benefiting only the rich. The robber barons, known in the 1800s, starting with John D. Rockefeller, these people were able to gain great amounts of wealth in the free market by exchanging products or services to a large number of people at the lowest price possible. John D. Rockefeller got us off whale oil. Imagine the amount of time it takes to hunt whales, kill them, extract the oil, and so forth. Rockefeller made oil available to the masses, while Carnegie made steel available to the masses. Something either involves steel in its production process or is made of it. So this really helped a lot of Americans by lowering its transaction costs. Cornelius Vanderbilt allowed people to travel by steamship, which historically even kings couldn't do. Henry Ford he didn't invent the car. He made the car accessible to millions by lowering transaction costs through a more efficient production of the automobile. The Wright brothers, if you look at the plane they're in there, that is not something we'd be caught dead using today. The average person has access in the West to flight that is much more efficient because over time, through trade, voluntary exchange, and competition, better products have been made. So the robber barons, while they might have done insidious things through their foundations, in order to do that, they had to use the state, as opposed to the free market, where even bad people, let's assume they're bad, can't exert their power amongst you unless you voluntarily exchange with them or contract with them. Take the case of Donald Trump. Today, he's the president and has the ability to make an executive order to take away your bump stocks, to take away your ability to trade with people in other countries unless you abide by the tariffs and so forth. He has the power to take money by force, whereas previously, when he was a billionaire in the predatory dog-eat-dog private sector, he really couldn't harm you unless you decided to trade with him, decided to invest in his business. So this is a great example of how Powerful people in the private sector are not nearly as dangerous as when they enter the public sector. The greatest robbers of history are the people who've robbed millions of their lives using the state. Dishonorable mention, Adolf Hitler is not on this list, but you can imagine why. Men are not angels is often a reason for the necessity of why we need government, because people aren't angels, so we need a state. However, that begs the question, well, what species do you want running the government? These people are not angels either. And what we have happen is the most evil people are attracted to these positions of coercive power and allow them to create atrocities they would not be allowed to create in the private sector. Child labor is often a criticism of capitalism. In other words, if there's no state stopping children from being employed, businessmen will coerce the children into working. What we see on the right is a meme of the abundance of items created under evil capitalism and fair socialism, which leads to shortages. In other words, if people are free to produce and trade and invest in new things that make things better, that increase production volumes using fewer resources, children don't have to work. They can spend their time at school. You can retire earlier. By creating an abundance of products or services, you're allowed to have fewer people work to acquire the necessities needed for life. So child labor did not start in the 1800s with the industrialists. It existed all throughout time. Today, if you just outlawed child labor in Bangladesh, the children would either starve or go into prostitution. Inequality is also a criticism of capitalism, some having more than others. If you look at this meme, it says, I crossed 90 miles of shark-infested, hurricane-ridden ocean at night on a raft I made out of water bottles to escape free market capitalism, said no one ever. So even a more equal society, of course only equal amongst the citizenry, government has a lot of power there, just because something is more equal does not make it inherently just. It's much better to have income inequality and be on net a wealthier person. Barack Obama has a large amount of inequality with someone like myself, as does Steve Jobs. The difference here is Steve Jobs can't become unequal unless we choose to voluntarily give him money in exchange for a product or service. Barack Obama, however, when he was president, had the ability to collect money coercively, trillions of dollars a year. He had the right to bomb 7 countries without going to jail. If anyone else did it, they'd be called a terrorist. Is that not a great amount of inequality? Look at the amount of money Arizona alone gets, $9.8 billion just in their education budget. Are you allowed to coercively collect money to promote your economic agenda? Can I do it to promote libertarianism? No. I'd be seen as a thief. In 2017, the federal government pulled in $3.31 trillion, and they did it coercively. Not only does no organization have that much income, but no one has the recognized right to collect money coercively. That's the great inequality in our society that we need to focus on. You can look at the number of YouTube views PewDiePie has and the number of views I have. There's extreme amount of inequality there. However, it does not justify me forcibly taking subscribers, forcibly taking views, forcibly stopping people from watching him and forcing them to watch me. Inequality is not inherently bad. Initiating violence is. As far as monopolies go, great quote by Thomas Sowell, competition does a much more effective job than government at protecting consumers. The best check on monopolies is, as we see on the left here, embracing universal free trade. So the consumer has more choices and the businessmen have more competitors to which they have to lower their price and increase the quality of products and services they make available to the public. At one point, Blockbuster, Sears, and MySpace were all seen as inevitable monopolies. However, they've all gone out of business because people have appreciated a different product or service they valued more. So the freedom of choice in the marketplace is an important differentiating factor, as opposed to a political system where government has a monopoly on, say, taxation or courts, and if whether or not they produce a good product or a bad product, you can't boycott them. You have to still fund them or abide by the rules, or else they put you in a cage. Blockbuster, Sears, and MySpace couldn't do that, fortunately. Only these 60 companies were in the Fortune 500 in both 1955 and 2016. In other words, you get a lot of corrections in the marketplace. There'd even be more if there wasn't a coercive state giving billions to places like Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and General Electric and Raytheon. So there'd be even less monopolies, less oligopolies, if we had a free market. Monopolies continued. Walmart is responsible for raising the standard of living of low-income Americans more than any other government program in history. I'm sorry, let me read that again. Walmart is more responsible for raising the standard of living of low-income Americans than any government program ever. Head of the Ayn Rand Institute, Yaron Brook. In other words, when you see the billions of dollars a company like Walmart gets, you have to look at the other side of the equation. In exchange for that money, they've given clothing, food, electronics, etc. Now, one thing that leads to monopolies is something like a minimum wage law, which makes it harder for other smaller companies to compete. We will get into that a little bit later. The next objection is the free market needs government regulation. However, you can have a regulation in the absence of a coercively funded monopoly like government is. So Standard & Poor's, Fitch, and Moody's are examples of regulatory agencies for the stock market that were granted a monopoly by the SEC, and they basically did a terrible job at determining whether stocks were solid. They failed to see the '08 crash coming. And this is a perfect example of, thank heavens we're not forced to use those, and those don't have a monopoly on regulating stocks. We can look at any number of things. So even though they did a terrible job and they're still in business, it's still better than having one group of people that are coercively funded and telling you which stocks are good, which stocks are bad. It's much more important to have competition, so people like Peter Schiff and members of the Austrian school can be out there, so we can trust their judgment, and even if you fail, you lose with your own money. Consumer reports are another way of regulating businesses. Good housekeeping is a way of testing products and services, giving them reviews. Yelp is another way. Let's say you find a fraudulent review on Yelp. Well, this also could apply to government regulation. They're people too who can be bought and sold. It's much better to have competition that is voluntarily funded and dealt with than a coercively funded monopoly in every way possible. Back to the minimum wage. The Fight for 15 is a large movement in the United States. This is a regulation on how much employers can pay their employees. What this does, well, first of all, we go through 15,000 hours of government schooling, and we don't get a dime. Businesses do a lot of research and development, a lot of entrepreneurship tasks, research that go unpaid. This is totally justified. You could have an unpaid internship working for, say, Nancy Pelosi, where she doesn't pay you at all. But if you voluntarily choose something, you have the right to get $0 just to get the education, $1, $5, $10, $20, whatever. This regulation makes it harder for smaller businesses to compete with larger ones. The Walmarts of the world can bear the cost of $15 an hour. The mom and pop supermarkets cannot. This creates oligopolies. This creates monopolies. Pages in the Federal Register. The idea that deregulation is existing and is the cause of the financial crash, well, this is just clearly untrue. Again, the number of regulations make it harder to, first of all, for individuals to get their foot in the door and start competing with the bigger companies. And the bigger companies have the resources, money, and lawyers to comply with these, whereas the average person does not. Regulation continued. Dr. Mary Ruwart says a free market is the only way to control corporations. As long as government has the power to regulate business, businesses will control the government by funding the candidate that legislates in their favor. More on this on the next slide. The economist Ludwig von Mises says the average man is both better informed and less corruptible in the decisions he makes as a consumer than as a voter at political elections. In other words, if you think, well, people are too dumb to look up the quality or safety of items before using them as customers, well, then they're far too ignorant to vote for politicians who make laws that affect all aspects of the economy, that affect foreign policy, education, etc. So the criticism that ignorance exists, therefore we need regulation, applies more so to the state than it does to the free market. Regulatory capture is an aspect of regulations. Michael R. Taylor, the FDA Deputy and Commissioner, and Vice President for Public Policy at Monsanto, a clear conflict of interest, Henry Paulson, Secretary of Treasury during the financial crisis, and CEO of Goldman Sachs, former CEO, obviously. Now, if you look at PolitiFact here, it says Goldman Sachs was Barack Obama's #1 contributor is a totally true statement. See, what happens is they fund people like Barack Obama to say anti-banker stuff so he can get in and impose, say, the Dodd-Frank regulation, which put about 2,400 credit unions out of business. They do this to create regulations their competitors can't comply with because it's in their interest. And whether it's in their interest or not, the state violently dominating economic interactions is unjustified. There are standards organizations and safety organizations going back to 1894, such as Underwriters Laboratories, Standard Creation Committees. These are standard organizations that basically give their certification or stamp of approval. Voluntarily funded competition, again, far superior than the FDA's monopoly. Even if you love the FDA or OSHA, you can have a happy medium between these two. You can say, I am only going to buy things that get the FDA stamp of approval or the OSHA stamp of approval. Even if the products take longer to come out because the FDA has no incentive to get good products to market, well, then I'm just going to wait. You have the right to do that, but you don't have the right to forcibly stop other people from trading goods until they get the FDA's okay to do so. Moving on to the environment, this is a graph showing, according to EPA.gov, the miles per gallon cars and trucks have gotten over time. This increase has come as the result of free trade, innovation, private property, competition, and voluntary exchange. The government simply making laws that say cars can only go X amount of gallons. Well, that hurts people who can't afford that at this point in their life. Competition's the result of better products and services, as we can see right here. With all those floppy disks, think of all the resources it uses to create all those. You can only store 132 megabytes of information. On the much smaller, much more economic, much more environmentally friendly, much more efficient flash drive, you can get 128 gigabytes of software. So you're not only saving resources, you're getting more with fewer resources because of the profit incentive inherent in the free market. Again, we have the brick there of a cell phone, and that uses many more wires, many more resources, and both natural and added on in the production process. And over time, they use fewer and fewer, and the products get better. They have more apps. They can do more things. They have FaceTime. You can talk to people in China. Amazing things here. Another example of free market leading to environmentally friendly results. We have CDs. Look at all those CDs, and now, today, at a much cheaper rate, probably the price of, one of those lines of CDs, you can buy an iPod and store much more information. Look at all the resources that's saving there. Now look at the tree genocides that have been saved by the Kindle. All that paper used can now be downloaded into PDFs on the Kindle. Books can be bought on Kindle. You can use your iPad. Much more efficient ways of doing things. Electronic mail has replaced paper mail a lot. This is another way the environment has been rewarded as a result of free market exchange and respect for private property, because people had the profit incentive to make things more efficient for customers. Government has no such incentive. Have to deal with them either way. The world's first computer was as big as a house room and did diddly squat compared to this very nice thin iPad, which does much more using, I don't know, 1/1000th of the resources. The next criticism of free markets is that it exploits workers. In other words, if you look at 1970, you have OSHA and things radically fall as far as workplace fatalities go. And isn't this the evidence we need OSHA? Look at the sharp decline in fatalities since 1970. However, what they don't show you is way before OSHA, workplace deaths started falling rapidly. This was a result of competition, of innovation, and either way, I have the right to risk my life. I even have the right to take my life. Government has no right to forcefully interfere in any economic exchanges, even if they think it's too dangerous. Of course, the people who start wars and kill people by the millions are really worried about how safe my workplace is. Again, does the free market exploit workers and the working class? Well, there's a book called Who's the Fairest of Them All? The Truth About Opportunity, Taxes, and Wealth in America by Stephen Moore. And he presents this graph from the Dallas Federal Reserve based on Census Bureau data. Here we have all households in 1970. 71% of them had a washing machine, 44 clothes dryer. It also goes on to list dishwasher, refrigerator, stove, microwave, color TV, video cassette/DVD, personal computer, telephone, cell phone, air conditioner. In all of these essential items, we think of them as essential today, fewer of all households in 1970 had them compared to the poor Americans in 2005. In other words, access increases over time when there is a free market, when there is a profit incentive, when there is competition. Not only does access increase, all of these items are much more efficient and of higher quality today as a result of free markets, not congressmen writing down words on paper. Exploitation of workers continued. A businessman cannot force you to buy his product. If he makes a mistake, he suffers the consequences. If he fails, he takes the loss. A bureaucrat forces you to obey his decisions, whether you agree with him or not. If he makes a mistake, you suffer the consequences. If he fails, he passes the loss on to you in the form of heavier taxes. By Ayn Rand. Interesting, she says heavier if he fails, not the same. See, after Pearl Harbor, after 9/11, when the government fails to uphold its duty to, say, protect us, what actually happens is their budgets rapidly increase because they say, we know we inherently have the solution. It must be a money problem. Very important fallacy. The next criticism of free markets is that free markets cause recessions. The opposing viewpoints, well, there is the Keynesian viewpoint. You essentially have the Karl Marx Das Kapital version of what happens. In other words, free markets are inherently unstable. There's this contradiction in businesses trying to get the lowest price, consumers trying to get as much as they can, the employers trying to exploit the workers, and this causes turmoil, this causes recession. Another view was brought forth by an economist at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, Murray Rothbard, in his book Economic Depressions, Their Cause and Cure, in which Murray Rothbard says, banks would never be able to expand credit in concert were it not for the intervention and encouragement of government. In other words, in 1913, when the state grants the Federal Reserve a monopoly on money printing and interest rates, what ends up happening is when they lower the interest rate artificially, there are less resources available than otherwise would be. People increase rapidly their consumption. This distorts the price signal. So you have places like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac giving collateralized debt obligations and mortgage-backed securities to people so they can buy houses. You also have the Community Reinvestment Act of 1979 saying, well, we know you're discriminating against women or minorities, so you have to give them the loan, whether they can pay it back or not, and the government will back you in doing this. A bunch of people got loans they couldn't afford, and the result was the housing bubble. Today it's happening, same thing with Sallie Mae. President Bush, everyone needs to get a house. You have a housing crash. Today, everyone needs to go to college. In other words, after 12 years of government school, you're so useless. We need you to go to college or else you're useless. Let's make college happen. Sallie Mae. Just saying, hey, let's create another recession for the bankers. Now, who benefits under a system of capitalism? It's often said, well, the rich benefit, obviously. That's why they support it. Well, being pro-business and being pro-capitalism are not the same thing. Being pro-free market capitalism is really to the advantage of the consumer and anyone who values freedom, voluntary exchange, and trade, and peace. Now, a lot of businesses don't like the competition they have to face, so they engage in what's loosely called crony capitalism or any form of statism. More communism, fascism, socialism, increase in state power, etc. Capitalism has been called a system of greed, yet it is the system that raised the standard of living of its poor citizens to heights no collectivist system has ever begun to equal and no tribal gang can conceive of. In other words, when people are more free, they have the ability to make more voluntarily, mutually beneficial exchanges, which make them more wealthy. Here we have an image from the movie Wall Street in which Michael Douglas, Gordon Gekko, I think, 1988, this movie was made. Maybe that was Platoon. But the rich guy is able to talk on a phone that's not connected to anything. This is the cell phone. Today, the average person, you don't have to be a Wall Street banker to have a phone that's much better, does a lot more things, creates a lot more value for your life, allowing you to access way more things. So capitalism does benefit people of all classes. This is an example below of laptops. One of the first laptops around, made by IBM. IBM's going to be a monopoly. And today we have the MacBook Air. Much more thin, you can access way more things. So it not only goes down in price over time, because the goal is to get as many customers as possible, it also meets consumer demand in a more effective way by allowing you to do more things with the item you couldn't previously do with others. Now, who benefits continued? When you have money and you exchange it for a good voluntarily, both parties benefit, or else they wouldn't have engaged in the trade initially. So whenever you coerce trade, then it's not trade. Whenever you coerce someone into doing something, you, by definition, make them less wealthy because you're forcing them to do something they wouldn't do voluntarily. Capitalism is inherently a wealth creator. Statism and violence are inherently wealth destroyers. When an employer offers you money, which you can later exchange for goods, products, services, investment, savings later on, in exchange for your time, you benefit because you get the money, or you can say no, and he benefits because he gets your time, or she benefits. Who benefits continued? Well, a great deal of people have access goods under a system of free trade and private property, and this allows them to give to charity. Again, we have sort of standards organizations in the charity market. You have Charity Watchdog, helping you give wisely to charity. You have Charity Navigator, making sure you're giving to places that aren't fraudulent. Government is 100% fraudulent because it collects its money coercively. America's 50 Worst Charities exposed. With a little research, you can make sure your money's going to places effectively. You don't need the state to write down words and collect money coercively to help the poor. Global Giving is another place. For further reading on this topic, you have The Myth of the Robber Barons by Bert Folsom, an excellent book on the history of capitalism. You have The Problem with Socialism by Tom DeLorenzo, mentions the 10 biggest fallacies that socialists engage in. Meltdown by Thomas E. Woods Jr. This book is great at explaining why financial crises exist. He even goes into the Great Depression, goes into Glass-Steagall, and goes into the troubled asset relief package, as well as the 2008 financial crash. And most importantly, I'd have to say How Capitalism Saved America, The Untold History of Our Country from the Pilgrims to the Present by Thomas J. DiLorenzo. Thank you for watching. Please comment below. Let me know what you think. Take care.